turns out that the job of leading the RAC was also made for Rabbi Jonah Pesner, who's a Generation Xer and a charismatic leader who has spent the last 2 decades at congregations and in campaigns across North America. If you haven't met Rabbi Pesner, you will soon understand why he inspires us each and every day. Let me turn it over to Rabbi Jonah Pesner to really get this call going.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. One of the great privileges of serving in leadership at the Religious Action Center in Washington is working with a phenomenal deputy, Rachel Lazar, who is a true hero and did great work in organizing this wonderful commemoration of the March in Selma. In the days ahead, across the Jewish world, we're going to celebrate the holiday of Purim, and we're going to wear costumes and sing songs and eat ham and tashin and rejoice. But we'll also tell a story of real danger. We will hear the story of how Haman and his allies attempted to destroy the Jewish people. But with moral courage and enormous risk, Mordecai and Esther take action. The scroll of Esther reports that Mordecai famously reassured a nervous Esther, saying, "Perhaps it was for such a time as this that God made you in this place to be queen." In resisting oppression and genocide, our ancestors remind us of the danger when those who are racist, anti-Semitic, or hateful in any way seek to destroy or oppress any group. But they also remind us that resistance is possible. But acting with moral courage takes risk. And so it was during the civil rights movement in the United States that Dr. King and others who joined local activists in Selma, Alabama, to fight for one simple thing, a thing many of us take for granted, the right to vote. Of course, it was part of a much larger struggle to end the oppression of black Americans, which included many cruel murders. In fact, several leaders lost their lives as part of the famous march in Selma. So as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday and the march in Selma, which coincides with the festival of Purim, let us honor the memory of those like Mordecai and Esther, like Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, like James Bevel and James Reed, and like Amelia Boynton, a modern-day Esther, the march organizer who was beaten senseless. This Shabbat, I will have the great honor of representing the Reformed Jewish movement as we march with President Obama and dozens of senators and congressmen in reenacting the history of 50 years ago. And I will have the opportunity to offer a prayer. And in so doing, I will echo thousands of years of the voice of Jewish tradition in which God calls to us today to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. And so as we go forward on our march with God, let us face the dangers of racism and injustice that lie ahead even today, even at such a time as this, as it says in the scroll of Esther, knowing the risk, but full of the moral courage to do justice.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Pesner. Sadly, Al Borsman, who is slated to join us next, is home sick with the flu. But we are thrilled to have with us today, calling in from 2:30 in the morning in Israel, Rabbi Dick Hirsch, who's actually the founding director of the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism. Rabbi Hirsch is the honorary life president of the World Union of Progressive Judaism, which is the international Reformed Jewish movement, and he has an incredible history of involvement in civil rights, which should really make all of us Jews very proud. Rabbi Hirsch, we can't wait to hear about your own experience in Selma and more about the role that Jews played in the 1960s in the civil rights movement.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay.
Proceed.
Well, thank you very much, and I wish all of you a happy Purim from Jerusalem. I thought I would talk about, very briefly, 4 highlights. Number 1, how did I meet Martin Luther King? The rabbi of the Reformed Synagogue in Atlanta was a very good friend of Martin Luther King, and when we established the Religious Action Center, and I came to Washington in the beginning of 1962, Martin Luther King came to visit me at the suggestion of our rabbi in Atlanta. and I found him to be a brilliant intellectual and knowledgeable about Bible and all, but one thing, he didn't have any money. And he had just started this organization, and I said, listen, anytime you come to Washington, you need an office, we'll always find an office for you. And he very frequently availed himself of that opportunity. The second highlight I want to point out to you is that we were the headquarters for the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. The truth is that most of the organizations, and most of the Jewish organizations did not want to participate because people were afraid of violence. We went into it immediately, and we were the headquarters. We painted signs, and a lot of the leadership, including the African-American leadership, came to our building on those days, and we have all kinds of pictures of that event. The third highlight is that when I first came to Washington, I was in contact with the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which was the umbrella coordinating body of all civil rights groups. And they were the ones who dealt with the legislation which was being advocated by all of these groups for the Congress. They also didn't have any money. And we had this big empty building. I was all alone there to begin with. It was only four stories. And some of you, I assume, have been in the religious section. You now know it's filled to the rafters with people and activity. But in those days, it was kind of empty. So I said to the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, why don't you come and have your office with us, and we'll just charge you a nominal rent. As a result of that, in our conference room, every single discussion which was held in the deliberations regarding the civil rights legislation of the 1960s were held in our conference room. And we should be very proud of that because we were the venue for the deliberations concerning the legislation. Selma, Alabama. Martin Luther King had tried to register the voters. The sheriff in town prevented them. They treated the African Americans brutally. The white citizens stood by and laughed. Martin Luther King issued a call to the religious groups to come down. There were 15 of us who left from Washington. There were 13 Protestant ministers, one Catholic Monsignor, and I was the, quotes, Jewish, as if they're any other kind of rabbi. And we arrived in Selma, Alabama, responding to Martin Luther King's call, and he was preaching at the church. There were thousands of people outside, and the church was packed to the rafters. Martin Luther King was speaking. They put us up on the pulpit, and he finishes speaking, and he turns to me and he says, Dick, you're next. And I was totally unprepared, but I responded, and I think I gave one of the greatest talks I ever gave in my life. I used three sentences, not one word of which was mine, because I took sentences from Jewish tradition. And according to Jewish tradition, our rabbis asked, why did God create man using only one man? After all, if God wanted to make billions and billions of people in the world, why did he only create one man at the beginning of the universe? And our rabbis answered so that no one would ever be able to say, my father is better than your father. And I issued that statement, and suddenly the congregation broke out, hallelujah, brother, give it to him, Rabbi. They began dancing in the aisles. Martin Luther King quieted him down. And I came with my second statement from Jewish tradition. Why did God create man using dust from the four corners of the earth? And our rabbis answered, so that no one would ever be able to say, the place from which I come is better than the place from which you come. And again, the congregation broke out in, hallelujah, brother, that's great, Rabbi. Martin Luther King quieted him down. I issued my third sentence. When God created man, he used every color of dust. Why? So that no one would ever be able to say, the color of my skin is better than the color of your skin. And again, another 10 minutes of dancing in the aisles. And then I concluded my talk. as I said, really wasn't my words, extemporaneous talk with tremendous feeling of enthusiasm and gratification, because I thought that Jewish values and Jewish tradition had been applied to a burning issue, and that it had tremendous impact. And you should know that Jews were active. Mr. Bond mentioned that in his remarks. Jews were active as Jewish organizations, and Jews as individuals were always up front. And we should be proud of our Reform movement and our Religious Action Center, because we were there.
Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Hirsch. It's really hard to believe that it's like 3 in the morning where you are. Right now to our next speaker, another Jew who was there back in the day, Rabbi Phil Schechter. Rabbi Schechter was actually in Montgomery in front of the State House when Dr. King spoke 50 years ago. And he was also a very active participant in the civil rights movement. He is currently the rabbi in residence at the First Presbyterian Church in Stamford, Connecticut. And he was 29 years the rabbi in Temple Shari Emes in Manalapan, New Jersey. Rabbi Schechter, we would love you to share your memory with us of being in Montgomery, and also to hear your reflections about the role Jews played in the civil rights movement. Rabbi Schechter.
Thank you so much. It is a tremendous honor to be here and to share with you this picture which you see in the very center, in the back row, is Al Vorspan. I wish he could be with us tonight, and I wish him a refuah shlema. On the left side, in the back row, is Kivi Kaplan, who actually gave us the Religious Action Center building, and his son, Ed Kaplan, who's now a professor at Brandeis University. I flew to Montgomery on a plane chartered by Americans for Democratic Action out of Philadelphia. I was serving then as rabbi in Atlantic City. That was BC, before casinos, and we had civil rights struggles in Atlantic City itself, with hotel owners who were not paying the people who made up the rooms sufficiently, and that same cause exists today. It was a very important day to be there and gather with thousands of others, and I was lucky enough to find Al Vorspan and Kivi Kaplan and Ed and several of my rabbinic colleagues. I went because Rabbi Dick Hirsch was, I thought, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And in those days, we all watched either Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley as a Nation every night at around 6 or 6:30. People gathered at their television sets and saw this very dramatic episode take place. And I thought to myself, Dick Hirsch is there. I've got to go. So I got on a plane and joined, and if you look very carefully at the picture, perhaps you could see at the top of the Capitol Dome in Montgomery, the capital of Alabama, the Alabama state flag, and then underneath it the Confederate flag, still very much a part of the society of that day. I was brought to this whole experience by virtue of my having served a summer at the temple in Atlanta. The year it was bombed. It was 1 year before I was ordained. And while there, I got to meet Dr. King, and I attended the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which, by the way, is the very first place that We Shall Overcome became a part of the civil rights movement, the song we all know and love so well. I became an assistant rabbi in Baltimore. My mentor, Rabbi Morris Lieberman, on the 4th of July in 1963, a couple of years before Selma, was arrested attempting to integrate an amusement park along with many other rabbis locally and the national director of the Presbyterian Church. When When he was asked by the New York Times, why did you do this? Rabbi Lieberman responded, it's the 4th of July. It's what every American should be doing. So on the 8th of July, I followed in his footsteps, literally, and was arrested along with many other clergy and other civil rights workers, including, by the way, Andrew Schwerner, who was later murdered in Mississippi. The arresting officer, and this is a little amusing, his name as the county executive was Spiro Agnew. Let us remember these great events that took place and realize that there were many events like them all across America. And while the march from Selma to Montgomery was the most dramatic highlight and caused the passage of the Voting Rights Bill, there were many workers in this cause, and a tremendous number of them were Jewish. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Schechter. Now we will hear from someone who really needs no introduction, who we are so honored to have join us for this call, Mr. Julian Bond. Mr. Bond has been a leader and really an icon throughout the civil rights movement. He was the founding member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and he is the former board chairman of the NAACP, and also a Georgia state representative and senator. He now serves not just as the chairman emeritus of the NAACP, but also as the president of Emeritus of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which he helped found and served as president of during the 1970s. Mr. Bond, we'd love to hear your stories about the civil rights movement from back in the day and your reflections on where we are now.
Well, unlike the rabbi who preceded me, I'm sorry to say I can't give any marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I have marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge several times, but not on the historic occasion as we've just heard. I was working in those years from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, what we believed was the best civil rights organization. And it was the one that was mostly populated by young people, and many of them white young people, and many of those white young people, Jewish young people. I don't think people listening to this broadcast or people learning about the history of the civil rights movement know the extent to which Jews played a role in this movement, have no idea what great numbers they participated in. But at any rate, I worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and we had begun to work in Selma 2 years before Dr. King came there. We had begun voter registration campaigns. We had several people living and working in Selma. We had people arrested, beaten, roughed up by police. It was a dangerous time for us and our people. I was the publicity director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really means that I was the flack. I was the guy who went to the newspapers and said, we did this, we did this, we did this. I wanted to make sure that people didn't think Dr. King was doing everything. People didn't think the NAACP was doing everything. Couldn't think that these other organizations were doing things that we were doing, because we badly wanted to get credit for what we'd done, because having credit for it meant we were going to get more and more support from Americans. And of course, that generally happened. But as I say, I didn't march across the bridge. I wasn't in Selma on the days of these horrific beatings and marches and attacks, kicks against people. But I was in and out of there many times. I would drive over from Atlanta, where our headquarters office was. I would talk with our people who were working there. I would write up the things they told me. I'd drive back to Atlanta, and we had a Watts telephone line, a WATS telephone line. That meant a wide area service telephone that was able to broadcast over many states at a relatively small amount of money. So we were able to transport what we were doing and what we were saying with newspapers and radio stations all over the country. And that's what the role I played in the civil rights movement, telling the story to others so that the story could get out and go around the country. So I'm sorry I didn't march across the Selma and Edmund Pettus Bridge then, but I have marched across it many, many times since then, and we'll do it again in a couple of weeks with a large group of people. I remember going to a hotel in Selma. It used to be a hotel in Selma called the Albert Hotel. This was a hotel built by slave labor. It's a beautiful, beautiful old antebellum building. And I'd gone in the hotel to see Dr. King, who was checking in. He would become the first black person to check into that hotel. And while I was standing there talking to him by the counter where guests checked into the hotel, a white man came up to him and said, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And the man kicked him so badly that he fell over. And everybody stiffened and jumped to see if Dr. King was okay. And he was okay. I mean, he was hurt and wounded a bit, but he wasn't knocked down. But he had the strength to stand up, and the policeman came by and grabbed this guy and locked him up and put him away. But I was just amazed at King, who just passed us by as if nothing had really happened to him. He was surely hurt. You could tell he was in pain, but he was in sufficient control of his facts and his life to control what he was doing and to be in charge of himself. But I can remember that he had such a control of himself that no matter how hard this guy had kicked him, and hard enough to knock him down, that didn't stop him from pursuing the movement as he did then and as he did for every day of his life. There are other little stories like that, but I'm sorry I can't say I marched across the bridge. Not that time, not that year, but many times since.
Thank you so much.
For this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bond, for sharing those. Now we're going to turn solidly to the civil rights work of today. We honor our past and take the inspiration and lessons we learned into our future. And next up is Rabbi Josh Caruso, who continues the very proud legacy of rabbis engaging in this work. Rabbi Caruso is the rabbi at Anshe Chesed Fairmount Temple in Cleveland, Ohio, and his dedication and leadership in social action work led to the formation of the Greater Cleveland Congregations, or GCC, which is a coalition of over 40 different faith communities from across Northeast Ohio working together on social justice issues. Rabbi Caruso, can you teach us all about what you have learned doing the civil rights work of today and how we can join the civil rights work as individuals?
Thank you so much, Rachel and Rabbi Pesner. I'm honored to be a panelist on this webinar, and also a proud rabbi of Anshe Chesed Fairmount Temple. One of our previous rabbis was Rabbi Arthur Lulliveld, who registered blacks to vote in 1964 in the Freedom Summer in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So very proud to be here and to stand in the same space he was standing in. I'll just share that my son's world is the way the world should be. Yes, my son. He goes to high school in Shaker Heights, Ohio, one of the first communities which integrated its public school system. Just last semester, he appeared in the school version of Les Miserables. He played the idealistic hero Marius, opposite his love interest Cosette. My son, white and Jewish, played his role opposite a beautiful African-American girl. The show's cast and crew, as diverse as you will find, attend school together, learn together, stress together, and think about their futures together. Like the idealistic heroes in Les Mis, these students believe that the world outside the walls of their school should be just as integrated as their world within. But in the real world, we often fail to build deep relationships with those who are not like us. In the first years of being a rabbi, I forged comfortable relationships with Christian clergy. We came together for the occasional worship service or Martin Luther King Jr. weekend program. After participating in a number of these one-off events, it It was clear that the impetus and motivations for these get-togethers were true and authentic, but we weren't deepening our relationships. More importantly, we weren't leveraging them to make systemic change in our communities. So after 5 years in Cleveland, I and a number of Jewish and non-Jewish clergy partners began to ask the question, what would it look like if we not only came together for fellowship, but united together to work for justice? What would that look like? And then we began talking to each other and asking that important question, what keeps you up at night? We gathered thousands of local residents at individual and group learning sessions and listening sessions, and we just kept on talking. I still remember our temple packed with a mosaic of Greater Cleveland sitting together, sharing their stories in our temple's foyer. In these sessions, we raised up the issues that are pressing on all the people of Greater Cleveland. We raised up concerns about jobs, hunger, and inadequate health care and education and the broken criminal justice system. We talked about all of that. But what resonated most deeply with all of us is what resonates with my son in high school. We shared an appetite in wanting to know the other, in celebrating our differences and our shared humanity. And then we leveraged our people power. A new organization took flight, and Rachel, as you mentioned, Greater Cleveland Congregations, an affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation, was born. Yes, we count more than 40 organizations in our membership, including synagogues, churches, and mosques. And after 3 years of building
Rabbi Caruso, you were in the middle of an important sentence, but we seem to have lost you. So hopefully...
Am I back?
You're back.
Okay.
Am I back?
Yes, keep going.
All right. After 3 years of building relationships and working on issues of shared concern, we were faced with one of the most devastating events in our community, the shooting of Tamir Rice, just a couple of months ago, a 12-year-old African-American boy killed by officers of the Cleveland Police Division as he was playing with a toy gun. The Tamir incident only highlighted the systemic biases within the criminal justice system. And we wondered, sometimes silently, sometimes out loud, would this incident have happened to a white kid living in the suburbs? And after the Department of Justice produced a 58-page report on the problems within the Cleveland Police Division, we, Greater Cleveland Congregations, pushed back, challenging the report's conclusion and asserting that there is racial bias, there is prejudice towards the mentally ill, towards the disabled among the police in our city. We were able to tackle this tough issue head-on because we had not only developed relationships with each other, but we had also built relationships and power with public officials during past years. We strategized, we researched, we acted. We brought 1,100 Clevelanders to Olivet Institutional Baptist Church in central Cleveland. We addressed the mayor, the county prosecutor, representatives from the United States Department of Justice. And in the wake of that sobering report, we asserted that every citizen in our city must be served and protected, regardless of their race or color. We issued our public officials specific recommendations and vowed to follow up to make sure that our concerns will be addressed, and Tamir's death would not be in vain, that in some way we could redeem him. And across the nation, our communities are burdened with this kind of mistrust. But we must not retreat. We've tried not in GCC. This moment demands that we take steps to remove the barriers and the boundaries that hold us back. And so I'd like to conclude with this story. More than a decade ago, the Cleveland interfaith community suffered a setback when a popular and very dynamic imam in town was discovered to have had delivered an anti-Semitic sermon early in his career. It was incredibly sad because the Jewish community had drawn close to this cleric when we needed to most after 9/11. Today that mosque has a new imam, and I've come to know the community's president, Shahada. To be honest, I was pretty nervous when we chose to have coffee the first time we met. I questioned if I should have anything to do with this man. Would my community support me in this meeting? Especially if this president supported the previous imam. Even so, I took the leap and I met him at Starbucks one afternoon. What has resulted is a connection in which we regularly inquire about each other's families and well-being, and Shahada's Mosque is an active member of Greater Cleveland congregations. And while we may disagree on the tumult in the Middle East, we surely disagree, especially this summer. We share the notion that by working together, we can build a Greater Cleveland. This is what it takes, we found, making that leap to build the relationships, as hard as it is, with those who are different from us, in our houses of worship, in our workplaces, in our schools, one individual at a time. That's what we're trying to teach. And what we do here in Cleveland is not to shoot too high too early, but rather just that individual meeting, starting with that. And so there is a national shift occurring. Jews are now looking to join the ranks of our past social justice heroes.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Caruso. And now I'm really excited to introduce KB Frazier, who's literally been the drummer for the new movement in Ferguson since Michael Brown's death. KB Frazier is also a board member and the song leader of Central Synagogue in St. Louis, Missouri, Central Reform Congregation, excuse me. KB, can you please share with us what it has been like to be on the front lines of the new movement and what your reflections are about the differences and similarities between the old civil rights movement and the new one that you're part of?
Okay. All right. So I'm a black trans Jew, and all of me informs my involvement in the fight against police brutality. At one point in history, someone who shares one or more of my identities has been brutalized by an authority figure of the state. It has happened to black folks, it's happened to Jewish folks, and it's happened to trans folks. On August 10th, my partner, Reverend Melissa, and I were summoned to the Ferguson Police Department for a prayer vigil. We had only vaguely heard about the shooting involving the police and a young black man the day before. There we met two of our rabbis, Rabbi Susan and Rabbi Randy, and lots of other clergy persons and other concerned citizens. After we prayed, there were several young people who were in the street. They had decided to sit in the street for 4.5 hours, the same amount of time that Mike Brown's body was left in the street after he was killed. They started chanting, "Sitting down for Michael Brown, sitting down for Michael Brown," and my body jumped up. I got my drum out of the car and I started playing. It instantly energized the crowd, and pretty soon more and more people were on the ground. And that's the first day we took the street. Since then, I found a strap for my big djembe, and I've carried it in most of the protests that have gone on since August 10th. I've marched for hours and hours, was pepper sprayed and tear gassed, too many times to even remember. Guns were pointed at us, rubber bullets were shot at us, and in October, Melissa and I were arrested simply for protesting. I've seen young people rise up from their despair and move into leading the social action here in Ferguson. There are many fantastic leaders who are shaping this movement, and they have decided that they did not want one person speaking for them, which has created an uproar. They have, although they don't have one person speaking for them, there is a coalition of leaders that have been able to stay authentic, but also come together for action. I know that this has been difficult for some of the older leaders to work through, but I believe that it takes everyone's expertise and talent, and the young people have been the reason why we are still talking about Ferguson and police brutality. They are the ones who continue to march and protest in the unbearable heat, in the cold, and in the snow. And unfortunately for us, the shootings continue. Since Michael Brown was killed, we now call out other names: Kajimi Powell, Von Derek Myers Jr., Antonio Martin, Ladarius Williams, Isaac Holmes, Thomas Allen Jr., who was killed last Sunday. I think what we learned from the leaders in Ferguson is that you don't have to be an adult to lead or participate in social justice movements. You can have a cause, believe in it strongly, build a coalition, and be persistent. Don't let anyone tell you that you aren't old enough or strong enough to be involved. I know that Currently in Ferguson and in St. Louis, we are continuing to organize and participate in actions, including having lots of sacred conversations on race, which continues throughout the St. Louis area with many congregations, including my own.
Thank you so much for sharing that, KB Frazier. As you all know, in Selma, activists marched for voting rights. And although they succeeded in passing the monumental Voting Rights Act of 1965, we are once again in a situation where people living in many parts of the country are facing obstacles to voting. For example, there are complex voter identification laws that require that people have certain types of ID to vote that can be hard for some to attain. Also, many states are cutting short early voting periods, which hurts most people who do not have flexible work schedules. These laws are discriminatory because they are disproportionately affecting people of color, young people, the elderly, and people experiencing homelessness. Additionally, there was a Supreme Court case in 2013 called Shelby County versus Holder that actually struck down some key provisions of that 1965 Voting Rights Act, One part that was struck down was Section 4B, which required that certain states with a history of discrimination at the polls, that they had to pre-clear any changes they were making to their voting laws with the Federal Justice Department. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress needed to create a new formula. As you know, Congress hasn't been very good lately at getting things done, so we are still pushing for them to pass a new law to do this. The Voting Rights Amendment Act, as it's called, has been proposed now for 2 Congresses, and we all need to apply pressure so that it passes as soon as possible. To learn more about the bill and to urge your member of Congress to vote for the Voting Rights Amendment Act, go to rac.org/VRAA, and you should see it up on your screen now, rac.org/VRAA. So, I've just been handed some questions that have come in, and now is the portion of our webinar that's going to be our Q&A. And actually, it starts with you, Mr. Julian Bond. This question says, how should the Jewish community respond to contemporary civil rights challenges?
I think it should respond as it always has, with bravery, with courage, with dedication to join in with movements that are going on, to become a part of whatever is happening in your community, to engage yourself as best you can in nonviolent protests that help to change things. These are ways Jews have comported themselves for decades and decades and decades, in my understanding, and the way I would expect members of the Jewish community to behave today. I will say something about Rabbi Level from Cleveland, whom we mentioned, just the last speaker mentioned. There's an awful ugly picture of him in Hattiesburg where he was beaten by white supremacists, but he wasn't afraid to carry on. He was a brave, brave man.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question for Rabbi Dick Hirsch. What, if any, influence did the civil rights movement have on the founding of the RAC? And we all have to give brief answers because we actually have a load of questions that have come in. Rabbi Hirsch, what was the influence of civil rights on the founding of the RAC?
Well, actually, the civil rights movement had little to do with the founding of the RAC. In the early days, actually before Martin Luther King and the riots and to which you referred, they were not issues of civil rights which motivated us. The recommendation was actually made by Justice Arthur Goldberg, who was a Jewish justice on the Supreme Court, and who was a member of Temple Sinai in Washington. And we knew that all the major denominations in America had offices in Washington, and were relating social issues to relating religion, their religious values, to social issues, to bring to bear the moral imperatives of the respective religious faith. But very quickly, the civil rights issue did become the major issue. I don't think it was, in all honesty, a major issue in the establishment of the RAC, but it became a singular and signature of our activity, and it's something we should all be very proud of. And I'm delighted when I hear this broadcast to hear that our young people and those who are now responsible for the RAC are not only perpetuating our ideals, but are advocating greater progress in society.
Thank you, Rabbi Hirsch. Let's see, I've got a question here for KB Frazier. What are the challenges facing the new civil rights movement today?
I think some of the challenges are social media. Everybody is trying to stay connected, but it's really difficult when we're relying on technology to do that. But also, the other challenge I would say is not necessarily infighting, but people not understanding when one person wants to do an action and the other person doesn't want to do an action. Some of that is going on, and you saw that in the movie Selma. That will happen in movements. I think part of the other problem is that intersectionality is a part of this movement, and some people are afraid of that. They're afraid that there are people who are LGBT. They're afraid of people who are younger than them. They're afraid of people who might be older than them. And having people come together and realize we are together in this one cause, I think will help out a lot.
Thank you, KB Frazier. Okay, here's a question that came in for Rabbi Schechter. Rabbi Schechter, what motivated you to go to Montgomery that day 50 years ago?
Well, actually, I mentioned watching the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the nightly news, and I knew my friend Rabbi Dick Hirsch was there, and I just felt I had to join the cause. I had already been active in the civil rights movement in Baltimore, in Atlantic City, and when I saw what took place, I just had to go. And luckily there was an advertisement in the newspaper by the Americans for Democratic Action explaining about the charter flight that was available.
Thank you. Rabbi Caruso, what is the role, someone wants to know, that congregations can play in social justice today? And again, we want to have a couple more questions, so a little bit on the briefer side. I know that's a big one.
Congregations can first start talking to each other. So Jewish congregations can start to get to know each other and move past perhaps a little territorialism to meet and talk, and then to reach out to other communities that are not Jewish. So there are lots of little pockets of conversations that are happening in every city, but there's probably not a lot of connecting of those dots.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to let one more question come in for Mr. Bond. It's funny, it's sort of linked to what KB Frazier was saying about some of the divisions today. Someone asked, what were some of the challenges to bringing together such a diverse and broad civil rights coalition in the 60s?
When I joined the civil rights movement in my 20s and became engaged in it, I worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But we, as an organization, also work with the NAACP. We work with Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. We work with the Congress of Racial Equality. And whatever group came along that agreed to be nonviolent and peaceful, we could hold out our hands and say, we're glad to have you. We want to have you. Join us, please. And it really had no trouble in opening our hands and doors to everybody who wanted to come. I think today's movement has to do the same thing.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. I will conclude the call with this. Let tonight and the anniversary of Selma kick off a process for all of us to figure out the sacred conversations and actions we will commit to take. Before we end this call, just take a minute to think to yourself about what your first step could be in reaching across the divides of race, class, and faith. Who might you ask to have lunch or coffee with in the next few weeks, much like Rabbi Caruso met with the imam in his hometown? We've also put together a conversation guide to follow this call and a list of next steps that you can take. These can be found on our website at rac.org/Selma, and it should be up on your screen now. We also hope sincerely that you will join us in D.C. the weekend of April 26th through 28th at our consultation on conscience to continue critical social justice conversations just like this one. Thank you so much to you all for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.